The government has said that it will adopt and take on those 6 recommendations. Do you believe that that is enough?
Well, look, they're geniuses at Spinhead. They've accepted all recommendations, just no responsibility. I mean, the Royal Commission findings, despite what the Prime Minister wants to pretend, are scathing. They said that that their plan wasn't good enough. They failed in a duty of care to all of the nursing homes that they have responsibility for. They knew there was a pandemic. They knew they had to put a proactive plan in place, and they sat there with an outdated plan, and people ended up losing their lives because of it. So no, I don't think them saying, "Oh, we'll accept all the recommendations," is good enough.
Well, they say that there had always been a plan. This is the government's argument.
It's just it wasn't good enough.
Well, since January, but it kept on evolving.
Yeah,
and that's fair enough too, right? Because at the start of January or February, people were kind of still on the back foot about the whole pandemic, not really realising just how bad it would be.
No, that is true. But as things started to evolve, as the general understanding that the people in aged care were the highest at risk, then was the time to put the resources in. But they got smug, they got comfortable, and they didn't act fast enough when it mattered. And lives were lost because of it.
Let's go to the budget next week. Do you believe that this is the most important budget in your lifetime?
Look, I was in Cabinet when we had to deal with the global financial crisis, and that was a terrible, terrible hit to many Australians. But this goes beyond that. This is the most significant since the Depression of the 1930s. So that's 90 years ago. And watching the government, you can't even say crab walk, sprint away from every economic philosophy they've ever had because they know they need to stimulate the economy. Some of the things they're going to put forward, the sort of tax cuts they're talking about, do not stimulate the economy. There is nowhere in the world that you can point to where the sort of business tax cuts they keep talking about, the sort of income tax cuts that they're focused on delivering, actually deliver stimulus. There's no evidence of it anywhere in the world. So they've got to make some really big choices next week about whether they're going to skew the tax cuts to the wealthiest 10% of the community who then won't spend it, or they've got to spread the money across the whole of the population who are desperately needing to spend that money to keep their head above water.
But doesn't it stand to reason, though, that when you got these tax cuts, that people will spend it, that money goes back into the economy and it kind of goes from there?
But unfortunately, a study of economics doesn't actually support that. If you give it to the bottom 50%, they will spend almost 100% of it. That is what the studies show. If you give the wealthiest 10% of the population a $10,000 a year tax cut, which is what they're talking about doing, then all of the studies show that they don't actually spend it. They might spend half of it. Whereas if you give it to people who are on pension, people are about to pay off they've been paying down their debt. They are desperate to spend the money to keep their heads above water. So if you give the money to the top wealthiest 10%, they don't spend it. That's just what the economic statistics show.
So what would you be doing if you were in charge of the till?
Well, I think they've got to bring forward the second stage, which is what they're doing. And there's parts of third stage you might argue are worthwhile, but they've got to invest in the infrastructure. But let's be clear, I was in charge of at the time, the biggest infrastructure project in Australia's history, the National Broadband Network. It took 2 years for us to work through all of the sort of gearing up for it. So any infrastructure project they get behind now doesn't mean that any jobs and stimulus are delivered. They're great announcements. ScoMo's favourite, another slogan, another press conference, another fantastic looking announcement with no actual activity for 2 years. So they've got to do a combination of give money to people to spend. They've got to support the economy going forward in terms of skills and training, which they're doing a very good job of. You've got to give them credit. They've targeted, the training that people are going to need. We've got to have people trained for the job.
Well, this announcement today on fringe benefits tax, and it's about that. So if you're in between a turnover of $10 to $50 million, then you don't have to pay that fringe benefits tax as long as you are training those employees. Do you think that can have some kind of positive effect?
Well, look, if they're able to target it properly and it's not rorted. I mean, these sorts of systems are often able to be, by clever accountants, rorted. But if it's targeted properly, if they keep an eye on it properly, then it can only be good for the economy. So that's the sort of sensible measure that you've got to put in place right now when the country needs it.
There's a lot of businesses who believe that the fringe benefits tax is just a dud anyway, and it should be scrapped. Are you of that mind?
No, look, I lived through the debate in the 80s for the introduction of the fringe benefits tax. And the businesses at the time claimed that the world was going to end, the hospitality industry would collapse. This was a good measure. It stood the test of time, and there is no economic case for a broad-scale dumping of the fringe benefit tax.
What about payroll tax? State one, but what do you think?
Well, look, the question is the states have then got to raise money somewhere else. And this argument that payroll tax is a tax on labour, again, demonstrates that advocates who say put up the GST and get rid of the payroll tax literally don't know anything about economics. The goods and services tax, in the way we have it structured, is 60 to 70% a tax on labour input. There is not that much difference in an economic sense between a payroll tax and a GST. That's actually just an economic fact. But, oh no, get rid of payroll tax. It's a tax on jobs. Let's put the GST up. Actually, that's a tax on jobs too.